Father, we're thankful for the day, thankful for the fact that we have woken up. We're thankful for our health thus far that we have. We're thankful for this time of study that we have set aside. May much good come from it. We're thankful for our teachers and for our learners this week, this morning, and may much good come from it. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. All right, we finished chapter 6 and looking at the things there in that place. Spent a good deal of time on chapter 6, and now we're going to go into chapter 7, and there is a very darkly drawn line here between chapters 6 and 7. Sometimes I'll let you know that I don't necessarily think there's a good chapter break in a certain place. They're not inspired, so I can do that. Chapter 7, I think, is absolutely a very good chapter break. We'll see why here in just a moment. I want us to outline this chapter and kind of understand what we're doing. Chapter 7 is a great example of what can happen if we do not take the context in mind, both the external context of what was going on seemingly at that time there in Corinth, but also the internal context. We'll see very early on in this chapter. If we take a particular verse and rip it out and just use that one verse for our belief, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to see that within the first 2 or 3 verses. So we need to take the overall context in mind, keep that in the forefront of our mind with every verse that we're reading. And I'll go into more detail as we get through the outline here, but I did want us to look at it to understand what we're going to be looking at during this chapter. We've titled this, or I've titled this, marriage. That's what he's talking about primarily, either those who are married or those who aren't. What happens if you are married and then all of a sudden you find yourself not married? He deals with a number of things. From verses 2 through 7, he's going to deal with marriage in the present distress. And we'll talk about that phrase, and you will hear me say present distress to the point where you may be a little nauseated by the time we get done here, because that's very important. That's part of the context. We'll talk about it in just a few moments. From verses 8 through 11, he's going to deal with the unmarried, those who aren't married at all, and also those who are widows and widowers, those who have lost a spouse, obviously. Then he's going to deal verses 12, 13, and 14 with the married, those who are married to an unbeliever. We're going to see in a few moments that they seemingly have written Paul a letter and they've asked him a series of questions. And Paul in chapter 7 begins to answer those questions. And it seems to be that one of those questions that they asked is, what if I, a Christian, am married to a non-Christian? What do I do? What should I do in that situation? And so Paul's going to give the answer for that. Verses 15 through 17, he gets to a kind of, in a way, I guess, the other side of that. What if I am a Christian and my spouse has left me because of the fact that I'm a Christian and she or he, whatever the case, is not a Christian and that person has chosen to leave me? What do I do in that situation? Verses 18 through 23, kind of touching on some of the, in a broader way, he's going to look at social status. What do you do as a Christian and you're someone who is well off financially? What if you're someone who is a servant or a slave? What do you do? What about social status and class in the church? That kind of goes along with the marriage there and the idea of that. And then verses 24 through the end of the chapter, verse 32, but he's going to, there's other things there that he's going to talk about through verse 40, is the unmarried. What about those who aren't married at all? What about those? And he's going to talk about that. We'll see that. We'll add some more perhaps to this outline as we go through it. But before we get to most of those, as we have done, let's read verse 1, because this is where we begin to get our context. Now, I've got the New American Standard that's going to be what's on the screen here. I have the King James. We'll talk about both of them. I'll mention why I'm using that as we get to it. I think it's a little more clear in the New American Standard, though, as we'll see, there are some things that I don't particularly like about the New American Standard, and we'll see because of the way that some things are translated. Verse 1, now, concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, as we've seen in chapter 7, or as mentioned, chapter 7 is about marriage. And so his reference here, his statement about a man touching a woman, this is talking about getting married. But before we get to that, notice the first part. Now, concerning the things which you wrote. Beginning in chapter 1, right after his introduction, he talks about their division. Now, why does he talk about their division? Well, it's been reported. People had told him about the division in Corinth. And when we get to the other problems, whether it's having to do with the court cases that we've noticed or the immorality or some of the other things that are there, Paul was telling them about those problems because he had heard from other people about what was going on there. Here we see perhaps maybe the main reason that he's writing this letter. Because he says, concerning the things about which you wrote. I've said several times, we are listening to a phone conversation, but we're only hearing one side of it. Here we see a deeper context here because the Corinthians have apparently written him a letter, and they've asked questions of the inspired apostle. Now, we can say all we want to about how bad the Corinthians were in a number of things, and we've already seen a bunch of issues they have. But one thing that's good about them is when they wanted to know an answer of a spiritual nature, they went to the right source. Not that Paul was anything other than the power that God had given him, but when you wanted to have an answer, they went to the inspired apostle. I would that we would all do that. If we have a spiritual question, don't go to an opinion, don't go to some book that some man has written and has his ideas in it. We should go to the inspired apostle, who, as Paul will later tell them in 1 Corinthians 14, if you think yourself spiritual, then you must admit the things that I say are the commands of God. He was speaking for God. And so if he were alive today and we had a question about spiritual things, there would be no better person to go to than to Paul, the Apostle Paul. And so they had written him a letter. And in that letter, they had, among other things, questions that they had a problem with. And things having to do perhaps with their culture, specifically for them. Some things on a much broader scale, as we'll see. But here in chapter 7 is the beginning. We could draw a line here. Before chapter 7, these are the things that Paul wanted to get out first. Pressing issues, their division and their immorality and other things. Here, he now begins to take that letter, and in a way, he's starting to check off the questions that they have. Concerning the things that you wrote to me, here's my answers. Here are my answers. And so beginning with verse 1, we don't know if this is the first question or perhaps it's the most important to Paul. I don't know. But here he begins to answer their questions. So again, as we have done up to this point, we're going to have to make some assumptions about what their questions are. They knew what they were. Obviously, Paul knew, and we can kind of guess what their questions were. It seems to be that their question is, in our context right now, is it good for a man to get married? And now notice that Paul says, according to that, his question that he's given, it is not good for a man to get married. Now, here's that verse we could take out. We could take verse 1 and say, well, Paul says it's better if you're not married. And that's what verse 1 says. Absolutely. It's better if you're not married. But there is a context here that we are, if we just take verse 1, we are grossly ignoring. I said there, verse 1, he said, the things which you have written to me. Before we can understand anything in chapter 7, including the first verse, we must, absolutely must, read verse 26. It is the key to this entire chapter. Because anything we talk about in chapter 7, we must filter it through verse 26. Because we have to understand the context for them and understand why Paul is saying that. Let's notice verse 26. If we skip all the way down there, Paul says, I think then. He's going to say a lot of things up to this point. But it is good in view of the present distress. It is good for a man to remain as he is. It is good for a man to remain, meaning single, not married. But notice what he says, why it's good. He says it's good in view of the present distress. There is apparently something going on in Corinth at this time. Some people say that there is some kind of civil war, there's some kind of physical difficulty that's going on in and around this area. Maybe some of the people of Corinth, there was fighting going on, there was maybe even persecution of Christians, though that doesn't seem likely given the time period. But there seems to be some kind of volatile situation here in and around Corinth. We don't have any historical record of what that might be, so it's not something of an empire-wide scale. It's not even something that was in Achaia or Athens and some of these other areas. It seems to be right there in Corinth there was some kind of volatile situation. And we don't know what it was. But he calls it the present distress. And their question was, in light of what's going on, whatever that was, some kind of difficulty. In light of that, should we get married? And so Paul says, well, in light of what's happening, whatever that present distress is, it would be better for you not to get married. We cannot say that Paul is ever telling people not to get married in a blanket statement. And he's certainly not telling them it's better for them overall for the rest of their lives not to get married. What Paul is doing in verse 1 is telling them that given what's happening right now around you, it would be better for you not to get married. Why? Well, if some volatile situation boils over and you have to escape, if you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have others that you're caring for, it's going to be more difficult for you to leave and get to safety because you have a number of people you're caring for than if you're single. So he seems to be talking to people who are going to have to flee very quickly. And he said, it would be better for you right now, at this moment, not to get married. He said, because of the present distress. So when we go back and read verse 1, and Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman, there are a lot of things we could say there that would be wrong. Paul says it's better for people if you're not married. Paul says you're more spiritual minded if you're not married. He's not saying that at all. In fact, the opposite is true. Some have pointed out that he may be saying that, he may be quoting from them. Is it good for a man to get married in the present situation? He may be quoting from them saying that. But whatever the case, he is asking them he's reporting to them what they were thinking. And so his answer to them is that in the present distress, it would be better for someone not to be married because of the things we've already noticed. Now, the church at Corinth, unlike some of the other churches, were made up of seemingly both Jews and Gentiles, Greeks. And so with that in mind, the church at Rome was primarily a Gentile congregation. The church at Jerusalem and others were primarily Jewish. The ones here in Corinth and other places like them, they were kind of split. And so the idea here is that there were kind of these two different ideas behind things. There was the Grecian philosophy of marriage, and then there was the Jewish philosophy. We're not really sure which mindset or where this question came from, so we can't specifically say, we can't with certainty say exactly what Paul is talking to here. The Jewish philosophy or the Jewish idea of marriage at the time was that marriage was absolutely essential and necessary, especially for the procreation of children. That God told Noah, be fruitful and multiply. Well, that's what marriage is for. And so if you were someone who didn't get married, in the Jewish mind at least, you were almost like a murderer. You cut off a family line. So that would be like killing someone before he was able to have children. And if you didn't have children, in that mindset, you were someone that was useless, might not be the right word there, but you didn't perform your duty, your function. You didn't do everything you were supposed to do. You quit before you were, that was the idea there. Now, the Grecian philosophy, the Greek philosophy of it, we'll look at the 4th century philosopher there, Menander. He says marriage, if one will face the truth, is an evil, but it is a necessary evil. All right, so kind of like the opposite of what the Jewish mind was. Marriage caused a lot of problems in the Greek mind. But it was something that was necessary for certain functions, and it helped someone further himself in life and this kind of thing. So we have these two, not really opposing, but these two different views about marriage. Absolutely essential, good, and for the purpose of creating children. And then the other one is, well, it's not the best, but it's all that we've got. Those are the two views that are here. And so wherever the question came from, Paul is answering that here. But let's notice that one statement that I made a moment ago. We can really take these verses out of context. For example, here in verse 1, he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. The idea of celibacy, that being single, unmarried, being alone is the best thing. Spiritually speaking, that's the best. Because Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, the idea of celibacy was not something that was taught in the first century church, obviously. And it was not really mentioned. We don't really find anybody mentioning it religiously until about the 4th century. And then even then, it was ignored for centuries. It wasn't until 1123, the first Council of Lateran, the first Lateran Council, Catholic Church, that they start to put that into their doctrine. For example, there in the 21st canon there of that particular council, they said, we absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons, monks to have concubines or to contract in marriage. And so even today in the Catholic Church and others like them, priests and others are forbidden to marry because in their mind, and perhaps they use 1 Corinthians 7:1, but in their mind, being by yourself celibate means you can focus solely on spiritual things, and therefore that's the more preferential one. You want to be single because then you're more spiritual. First of all, that's not what Paul's saying here in chapter 7, verse 1, as we've seen. But let's also take the idea of being single means you can be more spiritual. Who are God's leaders in the church? Who are the ones who were given authority in the local church? The leaders. Who are they? Elders. And what's one of the qualifications that they must have? They must be the husband of one wife. So according to Paul, and let's go even further and say according to God, which one is better for someone who's going to be a leader spiritually? Well, it needs to be someone who's married. And I think the wife has a lot to do with his being a good leader. She is a great help there. And so it's not whether someone is single or married that makes them better spiritually, but the idea that being single means I can focus completely on spiritual things, therefore that's best, that's not biblical. And it's certainly not what Paul's saying in chapter 7, verse 1. We've got to understand what he's saying here and filter it through verse 26. In the present, it's better right now for you not to marry, but he's about to tell them, but if you can't help it, if you must, there's nothing wrong with it. Do it. If he were telling them they shouldn't get married and it's better, then he would have forbidden them to do that. Understand, if I get to a point where spiritually speaking, I am forbidding people to marry that are allowed to get married, I am doing something that Paul would tell Timothy is a doctrine of devils or demons. 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 4, he said, that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, speaking lies and hypocrisy and teaching for doctrine, those doctrines of demons and devils. And one of those things that is a doctrine of devils is forbidding to marry. Now, very quickly, Paul is not prophesying about the Catholic Church here in 1 Timothy 4, as some say, but it's very similar. It's interesting how those ideas line up with things that we see in other religious groups today. Forbidding to marry, telling someone that is eligible to marry, you can't get married, that's what something that Paul said was a doctrine of demons. And so if that's something that's wrong, why would he tell the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 7, it's better if you didn't get married? You see, he's telling them in the present, just right now, with what's going on around you, it would be better not to get married. After it's over, get married. If you can't help it even now, get married. Because there's nothing wrong with marriage. In fact, marriage is sacred. The marriage bed undefiled. Marriage is holy. It's sacred. It's set apart. Hebrews 13, verse 4. And so to twist Paul's words in verse 1 here and say, well, he's saying that it's better for people never to get married. The single life is the best life. Well, not necessarily. There's a lot more temptations that can come with the single life. And there are a lot of other difficulties that can come. There are difficulties and temptations that come with marriage as well. And so to look at one and say one's better for this reason or that, that's not what Paul has in mind here. They're asking a specific question about the present situation. And again, we do not know what that is, but we can make some educated guesses about it. If you were a single person in April of 1861 when the Civil War started, and if you were in and around where there was going to be a lot of fighting, or you were going to be someone who was going to be drafted into the war, I think that same thing would apply. For right now, don't get married. Wait till all this is over. But even if you can't, get married anyway. If you just can't contain it, just go. Just do it. Because it's, again, marriage is sacred. It's good. It's holy. And that's the idea there. So we can't know exactly what he's referring to, but we can have some good guesses for that. I talked a lot there. Anything else in verse 1 that you've seen that we can mention? We'll see some other things that he's going to mention here as well that I've already said. Some of those things might make you furrow your brow, but we'll look at it when we get there. Verse 2. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, each woman is to have her own husband. Here's one of the verses. This is one of the things that I'm not crazy about. Our New King James, New American Standard, some of those. That word immorality, the King James, I think, correctly translates it fornication. More of your modern translations, that word immorality is a much broader term than what's actually there. There are a lot of things that are immoral, but there's only one thing or one act that is fornication. If you go to Matthew 19, one of the reason for getting divorced and remarried is that your spouse committed not immorality, but fornication. The New King James, New American Standard, I think they miss it on Matthew 19. The King James, I think, says it better. Fornication is a particular act. That's the reason for divorce and remarriage. But because of the temptation to commit fornication, each man is to have his own wife. Each wife is to have her own husband. That's the idea here. So it says immorality, but understand it's a very specific thing that he's talking about. Nevertheless, he begins this, but nevertheless, however, that shows us that he's not laying down a law in verse 1. Because if he's laying down a law in verse 1, then nevertheless would not be there. Don't steal. Nevertheless, if you really got to have it, go ahead and take it. You see, that's not the law. Don't steal. That's the law, and there is no nevertheless or otherwise or something like that. So he's not laying down any kind of apostolic law or something like that, but rather he is teaching them that just because we certain times can do something, situations might dictate that sometimes we need to be more careful and do something, maybe to put it off for a little while because of things you may not be thinking of. And so he's not here teaching them that it's better to be single and it's more spiritual. That's not what he's saying. Again, verse 26. The word fornication there, that from the Greek word porneia, and it's the sexual act. Pornography is immoral, and things like that. There are a lot of things that are immoral. That's not what is under consideration here, and that's not what's under consideration in Matthew 19 for the reason for divorce and remarriage. And so here is, if we can take just a little side road, here is the apostolic idea of how to avoid that particular kind of temptation and fornication as well. This is, here's how to avoid that. You, husband, you have your wife. That's enough. You wife, have your husband. That's enough. And so the temptation should subside there, or at least that's where you deal with that. And so his idea here is, here's how to avoid fornication. Again, it's better if you didn't marry right now, but if you don't think you can avoid temptation, then get married. Plain and simple as that. It's not a law. He's giving them his opinion here about which is better right now. So again, that context doesn't really apply to us today. And so the more broad, overarching idea here is that marriage is good in all things, especially to those who are able to do so. Marriage is not wrong, certainly not what Paul is saying here at all. God commanded Adam and Eve to get married, and I think I mentioned it in another slide here a little bit later. But I said earlier that the Jewish idea was that marriage was for people to create children. That's not the first purpose of marriage. What was the first purpose of marriage? Anybody remember? Companionship. Yeah, it is not. The first time the word "not" is used in the Bible is in the context of man being alone. It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a help meet for him, so that he will have companionship. That's the first reason for marriage. Whether you have children or choose to or don't, God's command was to Noah, not to you. And so whether you choose to get married, Paul said that's fine. Whether you are married and you want to have children, or you have, like me, too many, it's whatever your choice you want to make there. But children, that's beside the point, because children that's the relationship between a parent and a child is the only relationship that God has made that has an expiration date on it. There's coming a time when that child is no longer under your roof, and they're going to have their own home. That relationship changes. The relationship with a husband and wife is not meant to change ever until one of them dies. And so the companionship, that's what marriage is. And so that's good. And here Paul tells us that so the Jewish idea, philosophy of marriage was wrong, and the Greek idea that it's a necessary evil, that's wrong as well. Paul's kind of trying to meander between the two there. So God commands Adam and Eve to be married, If you want to avoid fornication, get married, because marriage is honorable in all, Hebrews 13, verse 4. I think I'm one of those who thinks Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, so if so, he wrote that as well. And so marriage is sacred. He's not commanding otherwise here. He's just wanting them to be wise in their decisions in what it is that they were about to do. And that was apparently what their question was. So he was answering the Corinthians. If the Eastsideans, if we wrote Paul and we had a question about marriage, we'd word it differently. They had a specific thing in mind, and he's answering that. Verse 2, anybody? Again, we haven't got to verse 26, but that's our key, and keep that in mind as we go through here. Verse 3, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, likewise also the wife to her husband. Being celibate, being single is not more spiritual than being married. I would argue that the wife and the husband, they are companions not just physically, but also mentally and spiritually. There's a help that's there. It's difficult to go through life without any help, especially close relationships that marriage provides. And so it's not the case that it's more spiritual to be single. In fact, when God picked the ones who were going to be the leaders, he said, you must have a wife. And so that certainly is something that we need to keep in mind. It's in certain cases, especially depending on the person's attitude and mentality, it's probably more dangerous to be single. Paul did it, and we don't see any indication that he struggled with that. There are others today that do that. It doesn't make them superhuman that they can do that. It doesn't make them weak that they can't. It's just that's how we are. And so maybe there was this animosity between those who were trying to be single and celibate and those who weren't in the church of Corinth. Again, we don't know. Paul says here, though, that marriage is a duty, is a responsibility of a wife to a husband, also a husband to a wife. There are a lot of things that can destroy marriage, but two things that can destroy a marriage: lack of trust and selfishness. What's mine is mine, including my body, including my physical things like that. And so when selfishness creeps into a church, it can destroy the foundation there of the local church. When selfishness creeps into a marriage, it can destroy that marriage. And so Paul here reminds them, in order to avoid fornication, in order to avoid dissolving a marriage, there's a responsibility that one spouse has to the other, but also that the other spouse has to the other there. 1 Peter 3, verse 7, Peter, who was married, had a mother-in-law, certainly understood the relationship there of a husband and a wife. Let's go to 1 Peter 3, verse 7, just to get the whole verse there, one you're familiar with, I'm sure. Likewise, husbands, dwell with them, your wives, according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Give honor there to the wife. Understand what you were supposed to be to her. Paul touches on that here in 1 Corinthians. Peter does as well. The husband is not a dictator. He's not the one who has his foot firmly planted on her head. That's not the idea here. Though he is the head of the wife, he also gives honor to her. She was taken not from his head that she would rule over him. She was not taken from his foot that she would be a doormat to him, but rather she was taken from his rib, where there is protection and there is honor. And so give honor unto the wife. When you submit yourself, when the wife submits herself to her husband, it's like the Christian who submits himself to Christ. Christ isn't a dictator. He loves the church. He loves the Christian and gave himself for that church. There's the honor. There's the sacrifice. That's what the husband's supposed to be for the wife. Same thing in marriage. We as husbands have a partner, not a doormat. You as wives have a partner, not someone who is a dictator. And so there's the idea here. And just in passing, weaker vessel there at 1 Peter 3, verse 7, just talking about physically. That's it. But that's the idea here. So he mentions, and only in certain cases. I'm sure there are women who are much stronger. But that's the overall point there. And so he wants husbands and wives to understand that relationship that they have. Husband's body does not belong to himself anymore. There's the selfishness part of it. The wife's body does not belong to herself anymore. You're giving everything to another person. And that's a very serious matter. And I think there are a lot of people today that enter into marriage without realizing how serious it is. They enter into it with the let's see how it goes for a while, and then we'll decide whether or not we want to keep going with it. It is a serious thing because you are literally giving everything that you own to another person. And you are saying, this is now yours, everything. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. Many people kind of look at it as what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. And that's the selfish part of it that comes in there. And so separate ownership of self especially must cease in marriage. Maybe that has something to do with his question here, but I thought I would mention it as we are talking about marriage there. The wife's body is not her own. The husband's body is not his own. And marriage, here's the point I was trying to make a moment ago. Marriage is not. That's not the purpose, whatever the Jews thought. Marriage is not for procreation. That's secondary. That's certainly a benefit. That's how children are supposed to come into this world according to God. But that is not the reason for marriage. The reason for marriage is companionship. That's its first purpose. Genesis 2, verse 18. It's not good that man should be alone. And so he didn't say it's not good that there aren't more people, so I'm going to make a woman that can make children. No, that's not the point. That's not the purpose, or at least the first purpose of marriage. And so Paul wants them here in the first few verses of 1 Corinthians 7 to understand currently, right now, in whatever you're going through, present distress, not good to get married. However, marriage overall is good, sacred, holy. Therefore, if you want to still, I can't stop you. And he wasn't going to try. Verse 3, up to this point, anybody? Or verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I think some in our society have like the first part of that, but not the second, especially those who want to be kind of like that dictator that we talked about. The wife doesn't have authority over her own, and this isn't just talking about physical things, it's talking about everything. But also the husband as well doesn't have authority over his. This is why even though he's the head, he's not someone who is the decision maker and the dictator there. There is a companionship, there is a cooperative that goes on here in marriage, and it's because each of them share equally in that. She is a help meet for him, equal to him, not beneath him and not above him. And so they are in this together. And so there is the authority there that belongs to the wife, and then one that also belongs to the husband for each other. It doesn't belong to me anymore. Here would be what Paul would tell them as well. If you can't agree to that, if you can't give that responsibility and that authority to another person, then do not get married. It's not for you. If you must, understand the seriousness of it. The husband doesn't belong to himself anymore, but rather the wife. The wife doesn't belong to herself anymore, but rather the husband. Jesus said, I don't want to go to the cross. I don't want to do that physically. He knew it was going to hurt a lot. But he said, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. You see, there's a surrendering over of will. Not that the husband is harming the wife there, but rather there's a responsibility, a trust that goes along with that. And breaking that trust is one of the reasons for marriage, the foundation of marriage to be dissolved and broken. So it doesn't belong to me anymore. Separate ownership shouldn't exist. We belong to each other, and if it doesn't stop, then a serious problem will arise there. Again, the lack of trust that we can talk about. Verse 4, continuing with the same idea. Verse 5, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer, to come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This may have another question in mind. He may be answering another question here, but this is getting to the end of this first section on marriage. Stop depriving yourself from one another. Now, we've talked about overall and broad things. This is obviously referring to physical things, sexual deprivation that's here. Again, this is not a command here, but permission giving. Fasting, I think the King James says. Other things like that. Don't deprive yourself of each other, except for perhaps a time when you are devoted to spiritual things. We're not going to, fasting having to do with not eating, because we're focusing on some serious things, so we don't eat. Here he's talking about physical things only for a time, because when that is not present in a marriage relationship, again, problems arise. And so he wants them to be concerned about spiritual things, but also keep the physical things in mind. This is not a permanent separation that they are separated here. He said, if you choose to do that for serious reasons, do it for a short time and then come together again. Again, perhaps there's a question involved there. Perhaps he's giving his inspired opinion about what they should be doing. And so stop depriving yourself one from another. Again, the husband and the wife. Verse 5. I don't mean to speed through these, but there are other things that we'll talk about that kind of bring it all together. I know there are those who are taking notes as well. All right, verse 6. But this I say, by way of concession, not of command. What Paul has just said is not a command. Doesn't mean he's not inspired when he's writing this. Keep in mind, because of the principle that he's injected here, because of the present distress, these are things they need to keep in mind. Perhaps because of the present distress, they were fasting from physical things because of the seriousness of the situation. And just like as you would do whenever you receive bad news or you have problems that arise in your life, you don't eat because there are more important things than that right now. And so in the present distress, here's my advice of what I would do if I were in your situation. That's all the way up to verse 7 that he's going to mention that. And so some will read verse 6 here and say that Paul wasn't inspired because he's saying, I'm just giving my opinion, not a command. No, he's giving his inspired opinion. His inspired advice is what they would do. And so he's telling them to be careful and consider the things that you're doing. The way that you're treating your spouse. Keep in mind and understand the seriousness of marriage in general if you're thinking about involving yourself and engaging yourself in that relationship. And other things that perhaps we are unaware of that they were doing. He's not commanding them one way or the other. He's giving, the choice is yours. But before you make the choice, here's what you need to keep in mind. And so it's kind of along those lines there. So certainly when he says here, I do this by concession or opinion, not by command, that has nothing to do with his inspiration, but rather his telling them, your choice, but make an educated choice, an educated decision. Because he says here in verse 7, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am, meaning single and unmarried. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. I would, in the present distress, I would remain even as I am. Think of how difficult it would have been for Paul going on these missionary journeys if he had a wife and children. And I'm not talking about the monetary expense of it. I'm talking about, when he was stoned on one occasion, or he was beaten, or he was shipwrecked, or all those put in prison, all those other things that were done. Think of how more difficult it would have been for him if he also had a family that he had with him, either trying to avoid that happening to them, or not going to certain places that were dangerous, not because he didn't want it for himself, but because he didn't want that for his children. There are a lot of things you can do to me, and I'll be okay with it. But if you do that to my wife or my children, there's going to be a big problem there. And so I won't do certain things because of what it would do to them. Or, if I were by myself, I would put myself in harm's way for the gospel, as Paul did. But because I have a wife and children, I won't do that. That would be Paul's temptation there. And so in the present distress, whatever that is, I would want them to remain even as I myself am. But then again, he adds that however. He must put that however there because he's not telling people not to get married. He's just saying right now I would advise you not to. That's their question, seems to be. Each man has his own gift. I would that all men were even as I myself am. He would tell them that he himself is not married. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ? Or not that you are my work in the Lord? He also said that he had the ability there to lead about a wife, but he didn't have one. And so he himself was, verse 5, that's it, 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5. He wasn't married, and so he said, I would want them to be as I am. He was a eunuch for the gospel's sake, meaning he had made himself single and wasn't going to get married for reasons perhaps we know and perhaps we don't know. But for the present distress, don't do it. Again, There's a specific reason, context that's here for this idea of marriage. But overall, marriage is still good. Marriage is holy and sacred and all of these other things. Present distress or no. Let's get through here with our notes here. We got a few minutes left. We may start the next one anyway. I would that all men were even as I am. Some can, Paul's idea of a gift here is meaning some can remain unmarried and some can't. Again, gift there doesn't mean that one is better than the other. I'm superhuman spiritually, so I can remain unmarried. No, that's not the idea here. Gift meaning the ability to or the desire to can also be a gift. He leaves this up to the one who is deciding whether or not to get married. Here's something you need to think about, your present situation, but overall, Paul's not going to condemn them if they decide to get married in the present situation. Here's what I chose to do. You don't have to do that. Again, there's his inspired advice or his opinion to them. He leaves it up to them. If he is not married, then it would be good in the present distress not for him to get married. He's got a whole bunch of things to say to people who are married, and we're going to see that next time that we're together. Paul had a certain kind of self-control. He could avoid that temptation. It wasn't as difficult perhaps as it was for others. 1 Corinthians 9 verse 27, I buffet my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means when I've preached to others, I myself would be a castaway. And so Paul had a certain kind of self-control there. And he says, if you don't think you can or you don't want to do that, then don't. But here's how you avoid fornication. Get married. And so in the present distress wouldn't necessarily be the best idea. However, I'm not going to tell you not to get married. And so here's his inspired advice, his question that he's answering to their question. And then he's going to use that to kind of branch off and talk about while I'm here talking about marriage, let's talk about these other things. And there may have been some other questions. He may be kind of conflating some questions and answering them all in one go. We don't know. But we certainly get the inspired ideas here from the apostle. Questions, comments? None today. I thought we might have some today. So I'll try next time. I'll try harder next time. Next time that we're together, we'll begin verses 8 and 9 because he's going to talk to the unmarried and to the widow. So we have a new group there that we're talking about. Still keeping verse 26 in the back of our minds as we're reading through chapter 7. Nothing else. Let's end right there. They'll ring the bell here in just a couple minutes. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate your attention.